Today I will talk about the conservative policies of Francois Hollande in France. He has, in my opinion, massively shifted course in the last few months of his presidency. Well, but first we should take a step back and look at history. Francois Hollande has ruled France since 2012 and had initially promised to halt the move towards austerity, which had destroyed many jobs and reduced the economic well-being of many people in Europe, especially in crisis-stricken countries like in Greece, Spain, Italy, Ireland, Portugal. He wanted to renegotiate the fiscal compact, which had been pushed by Brussels and Berlin. It was an IMF-style position paper which demanded most European countries to quickly reduce the budget deficits, even as the countries are reeling from massive poverty and unemployment. So, electing a left-wing candidate in France certainly matters a lot. Certainly in comparison to smaller countries like Lithuania or Austria. Electing a leftist leader in France is certainly a very big deal. And France has traditionally been the country which has been able to shape EU policies along with Germany, which is the other major player, which I'm going to talk more about. Now, with the election of another social democratic politician in Italy, Matteo Renzi, in Italy, there could have been a powerful French and Italian coalition to end that turn towards austerity. And I think the electorate in Europe is given a quite clear mandate for a change in direction. But unfortunately, none of these left changes have happened. In the midst of a huge budget crisis, the various European leaders have actually agreed to continue with austerity policies. I've watched the various debates by EU Commission President candidates Martin Schulz and Jean-Claude Juncker, whose election happened last year in May, and they both have agreed that following up on fiscal consolidation, which is a code word for austerity, is absolutely essential for Europe. And this is how they imagine a social Europe. In the meantime, in France, we cannot expect any new ideas to come from Francois Hollande, who is lacking a clear ideological vision to improve the fate of France and those of other countries. Rather than renegotiating the fiscal compact, he has quietly accepted it, contrary to what he had promised in his campaign. Rather than appointing more left-wing economic advisors, he has fired his left-wing cabinet member, Arnaud Montebourg, who was a Minister of Industrial Renewal. And instead he has appointed right-wing Manuel Valls to become his prime minister, and Emmanuel Macron, a banker, to serve as finance minister. And they pursue kind of like the wolf in sheep's clothing policies, that remind you of Tony Blair and the Third Way. The idea that you have to adopt neoliberal policies into the social democratic movement, into the labor movement, in order to become electable. Well, Valls has just survived a confidence vote in the French Parliament, where many Socialist Party members voted against Valls' superbly friendly approach to investors and businessmen. Raising the confidence level of the business community also implies cuts in the payroll and the business taxes, which really precipitates further cuts in the welfare state. Indeed, Hollande and Valls have rolled out a plan to cut government spending by 50 billion euros to fall in line with the deficit reduction plan. and at the same time give tax breaks to companies to spur job creation and hiring, supposedly. But I think it is very questionable how successful France is going to be by cutting various social programs, which have also been an important source of demand. In any case, France is following a long history, which no president has been able to escape. Since the 1970s, when the growth and stagflation malaise first made itself felt in Europe, Germany has set the tone for low inflation, high interest rates, low budget deficits, and of course, high exports to moderate unemployment. And the French usually did the same thing with a little bit of time delay. After a brief stimulus program in 1975, which did not change the unemployment rate, but increased the rate of inflation, it was part of the stagflationary period in the 70s, the French government of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing shifted to a hard money policy, which is austerity. The French then jumped on the German-led European monetary system, which lasted from 1979 to 1999, when the euro came into being. In 1981, interestingly, the new socialist president Francois Mitterrand decided to experiment again with the Keynesian policy prescriptions, expanding funding on social welfare, healthcare programs, pensions, and education, and shortening the work week. But that only spurred capital flight and currency devaluation. 2 years later, Mitterrand made an about-face by agreeing with the German austerity framework, and inevitably the gap between the rich and the poor began to widen by Mitterrand's second term in the early 1990s. And unemployment has reached double-digit percentage with no signs of decline in sight. Even today, we face 11 to 12% unemployment in France. And what makes the German position, now we go back to the Germans, so strong relative to that of France? Well, it's very simple. Germany's strategy is to undercut the neighbor by very restrictive wage policies, which in my opinion is very unsocial democratic, and certainly was made worse by German Chancellor, a social democrat, Gerhard Schröder, with his Hartz IV reform, which cut welfare benefits. And this only allowed very limited wage growth in Germany. And you add to that the cheap labor supply of East Germany, which has facilitated strong export growth. Germany, from that viewpoint, appears fiscally responsible by accumulating huge trade surpluses, which are then reinvested in deficit countries like in France. So they can get into debt, the French, and then they are then blamed for the fiscal crisis. The debtors are always in the hook and have to be disciplined, never the creditors. It has been an essential part of neoliberal strategy to load a lot of debt on developing countries and then force them to adopt structural adjustment policies which lower welfare state provision and force people to enter the free market, which leads to social polarization and massive increase in inequality. And the same logic is now used to attack the countries of the central periphery, which is Southern Europe, but now, as we speak, also is including France. We could say that in such a situation, France really does not have much choice and just needs to do what is expected of them, which is to commit to austerity, which is what Hollande is doing. But doing what is expected of them will simply exacerbate the unemployment, growth, and debt crisis, which are precisely the outcomes that the countries have said they wanted to avoid. There is no economic growth which will be generated out of nowhere. Somebody has to consume. And cutting the state budget is not guaranteed to reduce the deficit if all of the other private sector actors are also pulling back on spending. It will also not work if all of the other foreign trading partners are pulling back on consumption. Even Germany faces almost no economic growth. So even the economic powerhouse of Europe that has been celebrated by the creditors and by the Germans themselves, quite frankly, are facing economic stagnation because the other countries are just not buying as much as they used to from the Germans. This is what they did not really intend, but this is what the austerity prescription in the European periphery has brought to them. For that reason, let me conclude, we need a reinvigoration of the political left, particularly from a crucial country like in France, where there is quite a long tradition of leftist and socialist movements. In the most ideal case, we also need the victory of more clearly left-wing parties in Germany. And there's one, Bodo Ramelow, who became the um, prime minister of a province in eastern Germany, Thüringen. And let's see whether there will be more political success in the future for the left party in Germany. And we also need more left-wing support in other surplus countries, trade surplus countries, which would allow the European neighbors to breathe a little bit easier, with allowing them to, have, import a little bit less, allow them to export a little bit more, and prevent them from cutting their wages too deeply. The social and economic costs of elevated unemployment, especially among the youth, is staggering. And it's not just in France, but it's across the European Union today. We cannot retreat and allow weak leaders like Francois Hollande and others to continue to mismanage the country. Only a new Marshall Plan in Europe can offer some real alternative. There has to be an infrastructure program. There has to be a jobs program. There has to be investments in science, technology, education, and healthcare. And finally, we also need to reimagine a different world. We have to think about moving beyond capitalism, where profit and growth are not essential elements of the political economy. But until we get there, I think at the very least, there has to be a debate about the problems and the serious flaws of continued austerity.